All right, we're going to see if the microphone is working. Can people hear through that all right? All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Cusick, and I'm head of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History here at the library. I want to welcome you all here today, and thank you for coming. We have a great program this afternoon, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. I'll make just a few announcements first. One is that we do have books for sale by our speaker and by Larry E. Rivers. If you're interested in books, the University Press of Florida is here. They're on discount, and they've told me that if you don't want to buy a book today, they're on discount through the rest of the month, through February. And also, if you just want something to remember coming by, there's lots of great bookmarks over there, and you can pick up as many bookmarks as you want. Those are for you. Also, I want to thank the members of our campus and community engagement committee for helping me to organize this, and especially Barrett Euler, who made the bookmarks for us, which we very much appreciate. So the agenda for today is we're going to have a talk first, which is going to run for about 40 minutes, and we'll take some questions and answers. And then after the talk, we're going to pull a table up here so that both our guests, both our speakers, can take questions and talk a little bit about the practice of history and the discipline of history. All right. So our speaker today is Larry Omar Rivers, who is associate professor of history at University of West Georgia. University of West Georgia. Sorry for that slip. University of West Georgia. He has his PhD. He holds his PhD and his MA in history from Vanderbilt, and is a graduate of Florida A&M University. And he's actually talking to us today about his publication, James Hudson, Forgotten Forerunner in the Crusade for Civil Rights. But Professor Rivers also does a lot of other interesting work. And I noticed, among other things, that with a team of people, he has been working on history and investigation into Andersonville, National Historic Site, important site from the Civil War. And also has written about the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University College of Law as a publication. But today his focus is going to be on James Hudson, professor of philosophy at Florida A&M, professor and activist, very important to the underpinnings of the civil rights movement. And as I said, he will talk to us about the book for 40 minutes or so. We'll take some questions, and then when we're done, he's going to join his father, Professor Larry E. Rivers, at a table here. Professor Rivers Sr. Is a distinguished professor of history at Florida A&M. He was dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Florida A&M. He was the president of Fort Valley State University until 2013. He then was a history professor at Valdosta State from 2013 to 2017. And he's the author of many books that I hope you're reading, including Slavery in Florida, Rebels and Runaways, and other books. So when he joins as a panel, we're going to answer a few general questions about how they both got interested in history and what they find challenging about history, and then we want to take questions from you in the audience. We do have a lot of students here today. For those who are from Steve Knoll's class, I know that if you need to do a sign-up sheet, we have a sign-up sheet over at the table. You can sign up before you leave. And I just want to say on a personal note that I've known Larry E. Rivers for a long time. We both served on the board of the Florida Historical Society together. Larry Omar Rivers is on the board of the Florida Historical Society now. You're about to meet and hear from two very distinguished scholars, two eminent historians, but also probably two of the best faculty members you can meet. They're always very interested in their students. They're very generous. They're very kind. And it's worth your while to know them, particularly if you think you're going to go on to follow the discipline of history. And so with that, I would just like to welcome Larry Omar Rivers to the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You can do a little better than that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right, wonderful day here in beautiful Gainesville, Florida. A lot of great anniversaries to celebrate. So we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary of Smathers Libraries, and just a lot of great reasons to be happy. So as introduced, I'm Larry Omar Rivers, and very happy to be with you to speak on this occasion. I would like to thank the P.K. Young Library of Florida History for inviting my father and me to speak today. Thank you especially to Dr. Jim Cusick, curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History, for all of your work to organize this event. I also appreciate the support of Dr. Boyd Murphy, Florida Political Papers Archivist for Smathers Library. I first got to know Dr. Murphy while he was serving as an archivist for the State Archives of Florida. And so he personally assisted both me and my father during our numerous research visits there in the great R.A. Gray building in Tallahassee, Florida. I still remember when, after one of my research visits, Dr. Murphy invited me to contribute a chapter to a book that he and Dr. Robert Taylor were editing. That book project became the Governors of Florida, published in 2020 by the University Press of Florida. Today's event also serves as a gathering for a number of the contributors to that book. The authors who contributed chapters to that book include my father, Dr. Larry E. Rivers, Dr. Cusick, Dr. Murphy, Dr. Stephen Knoll. So thank you also, Dr. Knoll, for bringing your class today, and of course myself. My chapter on Governor Ferris Bryant relied very heavily on the C. Ferris Bryant papers in the digital collections of Smathers Libraries. So I thank the UF Digital Collections team for its work in scanning, organizing, and maintaining those papers. It's just wonderful to see so many historical treasures of Florida being digitized by the University of Florida, and I'll come back to that in a little bit later point in today's talk. Thank you also to the University Press of Florida. This year, UPF is celebrating 80 years of excellence in publishing. I can't do enough to thank my editor, Sean Hunter, managing editor, Mark Walters, director, Rami Gutierrez, marketing manager, Rachel Dahl, who's here, academic promotions manager, Jenna Colasari, who's also here, and all the members of the UPF team. It's been a pleasure to work with UPF and just a wonderful honor to publish with the press that represents the third most populous state in the nation. It's wonderful to be back on the campus of the University of Florida. Being here brings back some great memories. I think all the way back to high school. I was a member of the varsity boys cross-country team at Leon High School in Tallahassee, Florida. During my senior year there, my mom was the president of the boosters for the cross-country team. Let's go, Leon. And so in 1998 and 1999, our team participated in the Gator Invitational held at the Mark Bostic Golf Course on the University of Florida campus. So a great event that brought together so many of the cross-country runners from all across the state of Florida for both high school and collegiate competition. When I was in college at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, I was very active in the Student Government Association, or SGA. FAMU SGA held membership in the Florida Student Association. UFSGA hosted a number of meetings of the association in Wrights Union. I had the pleasure of visiting the UF campus on multiple occasions to participate in those meetings, and so UFSGA was always a wonderful host. During my senior year at FAMU, while I was student body president, FAMU SGA sponsored a bus trip to Gainesville to support the Rattler football team as it played the Gators at Ben Hill Griffin Stadium. More than 90,000 people attended. FAMU's Marching 100 performed at halftime, and as the Orlando Sentinel reported, the crowd of mainly UF fans gave the FAMU band a standing ovation at the end of its halftime performance. And so that moment in particular, I believe, symbolized the important connection between the University of Florida and Florida A&M as Florida's two land-grant universities. So those were the good memories of the game. The score wasn't a very pleasant memory. UF won 63-3. It's always tough to face the Gators, but proud of the great football tradition, so represents the entire state of Florida. A much nicer memory from my year as FAMU student body president was the opportunity I received to meet the late Dr. Michael Gannon. Dr. Gannon, of course, earned his PhD in history from UF and taught history at UF for 36 years. During the summer of 2003, Leadership Florida convened a statewide summit for college student leaders. It took place at the University of Central Florida. The director of the summit asked me to introduce Dr. Gannon, who was one of the featured presenters for that summit. It was an enormous honor. I grew up seeing Dr. Gannon's books in my father's library at home. I've long utilized Dr. Gannon's The New History of Florida and Florida, A Short History, both published by the University Press of Florida. When I met Dr. Gannon, I was also treated to his great sense of humor as well. He shared some kind words of encouragement with me when I told him that I aspired to be an historian who would write about Florida's past. Another great giant of Florida historical scholarship who gave me some welcome words of support was the late Dr. Samuel Proctor. Dr. Proctor, as we know, earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in history from UF. He taught history at UF for 50 years and served as the founding director of what is now the Dr. Samuel Proctor Oral History Program.
Yes.
I met Dr. Proctor at a celebration of his retirement from teaching. The event took place in the R.A. Gray Building in Tallahassee. In addition to featuring remarks by Dr. Proctor, the celebration included comments from the contributors to the book, Florida's Heritage of Diversity, Essays in Honor of Samuel Proctor. The book, published in 1997 by the Century Press, was edited by Dr. Mark Greenberg, Dr. William Warren Rogers, and Dr. Cantor Brown Jr. The chapters included Dr. Cantor Brown Jr.'s essay on Black Republicans and the Knights of Labor in 1880s Florida, Dr. James Denham's essay on women and their families in 19th century Florida, Dr. David Coles's essay on Black troopers in Florida during the Civil War, Dr. Harry Kersey's essay on the Florida Seminoles, 1880 to 1990, Dr. Sally Vickers' essay on Congresswoman Ruth Bryan Owen, and Dr. Mark Greenberg's essay on Tampa Mayor Herman Glogowski, Jewish Leadership in the Gilded Age of Florida. I was in high school at the time of that celebration of Dr. Proctor's retirement, and I remember asking Dr. Proctor for any advice he might be willing to share to help me on my journey toward becoming an historian of Florida's past. He told me to continue to work hard, to continue to read as much as I could about Florida's past, and he also told me to always listen to my father as well. He said that my father was an outstanding role model for me to follow. And so I've tried to take both the advice that I received from Dr. Proctor and Dr. Gannon to heart, but it was just a great honor during those formative years to meet those two legends of the Florida historical profession. My father's chapter contribution to Essays in Honor of Dr. Proctor was titled Baptist Minister James Page, Alternatives for African American Leadership in Post-Civil War Florida. As my father described in the essay, Father James Page rose from being born into slavery in Richmond, Virginia, to become a pastor, educator, and political leader in Florida. My father talked about Father James Page's life as an enslaved preacher in Florida at length in his first book with the University Press of Florida, Slavery in Florida, Territorial Days to Emancipation. I remember when during my freshman year at Florida A&M University, the institution's president, Dr. Frederick S. Humphreys, celebrated the publication of Slavery in Florida with a special reception at the FAMU President's House. Additionally, on June 12, 2001, my mother, brother, and I accompanied my father to the Florida Capitol building. There, the Florida Cabinet, chaired then by Governor Jeb Bush, presented him with a resolution that honored slavery in Florida and his numerous other academic achievements. So seeing this reception to my father's book helped encourage me toward my goal of one day following in his footsteps and becoming a University Press of Florida author. Father James Page founded what is today Bethel Missionary Baptist Church in Tallahassee, Florida. The Reverend James Hudson, the subject of my book, was a pulpit associate of that church. In addition, he was a philosopher, a theologian, a pastor, college chaplain, academic administrator, and civil rights activist. He lived from 1903 to 1980. I never met Dr. Hudson. He passed away 1 year before I was born in 1981. I learned about him through the countless people in Tallahassee who knew him and who loved him. Bethel Missionary Baptist Church was the church at which I was baptized. Many members of the congregation had fond memories that they shared about him while I was growing up and attending Bethel. People told me stories about how Dr. Hudson officiated at their weddings or provided them with spiritual counseling or delivered sermons that encouraged them during trying periods of their lives. Additionally, there were many professors and alumni of my undergraduate alma mater, FAMU, who knew Dr. Hudson. He served as FAMU's chaplain and taught philosophy and religion courses at the university from 1946 until his retirement in 1973. My book goes into detail about Dr. Hudson's national significance as one of the visionaries who helped to build the intellectual foundation of the civil rights movement, and in particular, how he was an important philosophical forerunner to Martin Luther King Jr. But my talk today will focus on the leadership role that Dr. Hudson played in the 1956 to 1957 Tallahassee bus boycott. In the public memory of the Tallahassee bus boycott, Dr. Hudson isn't as well known as the Reverend Charles Kinsey Steele. Reverend Steele pastored Bethel Missionary Baptist Church from 1952 until the year he died, 1980. Reverend Steele served as the president of the Inter-Civic Council, or ICC, the coordinating organization for the Tallahassee bus boycott. The Inter-Civic Council, or ICC, was the Tallahassee equivalent of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and coordinated the Montgomery bus boycott. In Tallahassee, Dr. Hudson served as the chaplain of the Inter-Civic Council, or ICC. Reverend Steele went on to have a much larger national presence when he, in 1957, was elected to be the first vice president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as president. Dr. Hudson never held a similar high-profile office in a national civil rights organization, but was nonetheless critically significant to the civil rights struggle in Tallahassee and across the nation. This picture comes from the Florida Photographic Collection at the Florida State Archives. It is dated January 3rd, 1957. Its note states that the picture shows, quote, Reverend Charles K. Steele with a 4-inch cross that was burned at his church at about 9:30 p.m. on January 2nd, 1957. The cross burning appeared to be a response to the ICC's continuing efforts to desegregate Tallahassee's segregated bus system. Reverend Steele and his family also lived on a parsonage by the church, so the cross burning was also a direct threat against their home. Early during the Tallahassee bus boycott, Life magazine sent a photographer to Tallahassee to take pictures of the protests. The Life magazine picture collection, now rights managed by Shutterstock, has released many previously unpublished photographs of the boycott. So this is my favorite one from that collection. It shows Dr. Hudson speaking at Bethel Missionary Baptist Church as Reverend Steele listens. Dr. Hudson and Reverend Steele both carried the torch lit by Bethel's founder, Father James Page. Hudson and Steele, like Page, embraced civic advocacy, political engagement, and the fight for educational opportunities as priorities in their ministries. Further, where Page had endeavored during Reconstruction to shatter slavery's vestiges by supporting the adoption and implementation of the 14th and 15th Amendments, Hudson and Steele would work to, throughout the civil rights movement, to try and crush Jim Crow by pushing for full unabridged enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Before going further, I'd like to also say a quick word about another collection from the University of Florida that helped me out a great deal during my research. I'm really indebted to the work that's been done by the Florida Digital Newspaper Library that is held and maintained by the University of Florida. UF has digitized the Florida Star, a black-owned newspaper that was founded in 1951 in Jacksonville, Florida. As far as I've been able to tell, my book is the first peer-reviewed study to make extensive use of the Florida Star coverage of the Tallahassee bus boycott. The Florida Star's back editions were difficult to access before UF digitized them and made them freely available on the library website. At the time of the Tallahassee bus boycott, the Tallahassee Democrat newspaper, the major newspaper in Tallahassee, was very critical of the boycott. In 2006, the newspaper actually apologized for the stance it took in favor of segregation during the bus boycott. In contrast to the unsympathetic coverage from the Tallahassee Democrat, the Florida Star viewed the boycott as a just and commendable cause. The Florida Star published an ICC fundraising appeal that conducted original reporting on the protest developments and gave boycott leaders a platform to regularly respond to attacks from powerful opponents. It also editorialized in favor of the campaign. And so this particular slide shows the front page from a June 2nd, 1956 issue of the Florida Star. But this is among a number of the great collections that have been digitized by the University of Florida. Also, the Miami Times, another black-owned newspaper, has been digitized, as well as a wide variety of others. So the UF Digital Newspaper Library has made so many of these historical treasures readily accessible, and it's really, I think, going to lead to another generation of new discoveries in the research of Florida's past. I'll briefly go through some background information about Dr. Hudson. He was born October 1st, 1903 in Birmingham, Alabama. This slide shows his parents. His mother, Alta Hudson, was a school teacher. His father, Barry Hudson, worked as a railroad porter for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. He went on to work nearly 37 years as a rodman for Southern Railroad Company. Both of the Hudson parents encouraged their children to get the very best education they could. The Hudson children were Theodore, James, Millage, Florence, and Ornette. One child, Barry Jr., died as an infant. This slide shows Theodore, James in the middle, and finally Millage. At age 6 or 7, incompetent primary care left a permanent mark on young James. While playing a game of baseball outside the family home, James stood close to a friend who was in the batting position. A bat meant to be caught by the batter was inadvertently thrown in James's direction. In order to keep the bat from hitting him in the face, James threw up his arms. The bat collided against his right elbow. Although the injury seemed to be minor at first, the pain steadily worsened. James's father took him to a local doctor who said the arm only had a slight fracture and was not broken. The physician bandaged the elbow and sent James home. The same doctor continued to treat James for about 2 months, but still the young boy's arm did not get any better. On many nights, the pain was so severe that James could not sleep. One day, after James and his father had just left the doctor, a family friend suggested that they seek out a second opinion. Barry Hudson, James's father, agreed and took his son to another physician who re-examined the arm and determined that it was indeed broken. But in order to be sure, the doctor performed the diagnostic operation on the arm, which confirmed his assessment. Believing he could save the arm, the doctor performed a second corrective operation. When the fracture continued to worsen, the doctor finally informed the Hudson parents that the injured part of James's arm must be amputated within 48 hours in order to save his life. The child needed an above elbow amputation. So convinced they had no other choice, Hudson's parents sadly gave their consent, and the doctor performed the amputation to remove the lower part of James Hudson's arm. And so this tragedy would affect James for the rest of his life, but he would be resilient. He would learn to clothe himself. He would learn to shine shoes for money. He would learn to write with just one arm. His family told me that he was not one to be picked on either. He learned how to fight with one arm too. He still had his legs, he still had another arm, and he could punch and kick. So he stood up for himself. But this was a tragedy that really contributed to inflaming his passion to fight back and his passion to wanting all people to receive justice and fairness. After graduating from the local segregated grade schools he attended in Birmingham, James went on to enroll in Morehouse College in Atlanta in 1922. His brother Millage also enrolled at Morehouse during the same year. They both graduated in 1926. James Hudson was the salutarian of his class. This picture from a Morehouse yearbook shows James Hudson standing third from the left. He was the vice president of the Morehouse YMCA. At Morehouse, Hudson looked up in particular to the college president, John Hope. Hope was one of the founders of the Atlanta branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and was a tireless fighter for civil rights. Hope wrote letters of recommendation in support of Hudson's pursuit of advanced studies. After Morehouse, Hudson moved back to Birmingham and worked as a teacher at a local school named Lincoln Junior High School. In 1928, he began pursuing his Bachelor of Divinity degree at Oberlin College. The next year, he transferred to Colgate Rochester Divinity School in Rochester, New York, and finished his Bachelor of Divinity degree there in 1931. This is a picture of him from his student file at Colgate Rochester. In 1931, Hudson accepted a job at the historically black Leland College in Baker, Louisiana. He served as a college chaplain and a professor of philosophy. Baker, Louisiana is near Baton Rouge. During this time, he also served as a pulpit associate at Mount Zion First Baptist Church in Baton Rouge. While living in Louisiana, Hudson met a school teacher named Augustine Lagarde, who he would marry on December 29th, 1937. So this slide shows Mrs. Hudson. On November 6, 1939, Mrs. Hudson gave birth to her and Dr. Hudson's son, James L. Hudson. Here's Hudson at Boston University. He earned his master's degree in philosophy there in 1933 and his PhD in philosophy there in 1946. The two members of Dr. Hudson's thesis and dissertation committee at Boston are shown in this slide, Dr. Edgar S. Brightman and Dr. Peter Bertocci. Dr. Brightman was Hudson's major professor. These two professors taught and mentored a number of African American students, and so there's an important history still to be written about these African American students and their experiences with these Boston professors who really worked tirelessly to help them with their academic careers and their training. So in 1951, Martin Luther King Jr. enrolled in the PhD in philosophy program at Boston with Dr. Brightman, serving as his major advisor. After Dr. Brightman sadly passed away in 1953, King transferred to the School of Theology to pursue a PhD in systematic theology. And his advisor for that PhD was L. Harold DeWolf. DeWolf had earned his PhD actually under the advisement of Dr. Brightman. Dr. Peter Bertocci served as a member of King's dissertation committee. And so one of the letters that I found from James Hudson's correspondence in the Black Archives at Florida A&M University was a letter from Dr. Peter Bertocci, who just said just how proud he was of both Dr. Hudson and Dr. King for their activism throughout the civil rights movement. When I went up to Boston University to view the Brightman papers, I found just a wealth of correspondence, more than 300 pages of correspondence that Dr. Hudson had written to Dr. Brightman. So he really saw Dr. Brightman as his intellectual father, and it was a close relationship. Those letters almost read like a personal diary of Dr. Hudson. And thus there's just a wealth of information that still is to be explored about the influence of these Boston professors on shaping the lives of their African American students, and also their contributions to individuals who would later become important figures in the civil rights movement. From 1943 to 1946, while he was pursuing his doctoral studies at Boston, Hudson pastored a church in Martha's Vineyard. The church was the Bradley Memorial Baptist Church in Oak Bluffs, Massachusetts. He stepped down from the pastorship after Dr. William H. Gray Jr., the president of Florida A&M College in Tallahassee, hired him in 1946. Hudson served as the university chaplain and a professor of philosophy and religious education. This slide shows Dr. Hudson, Dr. Gray, and others at the founding of the Florida A&M College, or FAMC, Department of Religious Education in 1947, which Dr. Hudson was chosen to chair. The department later became the Department of Philosophy and Religion, which Dr. Hudson was also serve as chair. Dr. Hudson's campus office at Florida A&M was in Carnegie Hall, which today is the home of the Carrie Meek, James Eaton, Southeastern Regional Black Archives Research Center and Museum. Dr. Hudson led weekly chapel services in the auditorium of Lee Hall. This, for many years, has served as Florida A&M University's main administrative building and the site of the president's office. The Hudson family lived on a house on Gamble Street, close to campus. This picture shows Dr. Hudson, Mrs. Hudson, and their son standing close to their home in Tallahassee. As part of my dissertation research, I interviewed a number of Dr. Hudson's former students who participated in the Tallahassee bus boycott. They cited the inspiration from the messages that they heard in Dr. Hudson's Religious Life program as a factor that encouraged them to take a bold stand against racial segregation. And I thank in particular Dr. Hudson's son, attorney James Hudson, for doing so much to help me throughout my research. I had a chance to visit his home in Washington, D.C. a couple of times. He shared a lot of his personal papers with me. And so a number of the papers that he collected after I had asked him to please share anything that he could about his father have now become the Hudson Family Collection that he donated to the Black Archives. So we have the James Hudson Papers Collection, which are mainly Hudson's professional papers from his time as a professor at Florida A&M, and also the Hudson Family Collection. And one great thing about the Hudson Family Collection is that it has a number of letters from Mrs. Augustine Hudson. So when I wrote my dissertation on Dr. Hudson, one of the places that I really wanted more research was to try and bring out more about Mrs. Hudson's voice. And thankfully, the papers, the letters that James L. Hudson shared, Attorney Hudson shared, helped to provide more opportunity for me to write about his mother in my book. Dr. Hudson, as his son, Attorney Hudson, told me early on when I began speaking to him about his father, used to travel to Howard University at least twice a year to participate in meetings associated with the Howard School of Religion. And so at Howard, you had at this time a national body of African American religious intellectuals who I have termed the Rankin Network. And the Rankin Chapel is the center of the devotional activities on the Howard University campus. But there were individuals such as Benjamin Mays, who had served as Dean of the School of Religion at Howard University. You had individuals such as William Stewart Nelson, who would succeed Benjamin Mays as the Dean of the Howard School of Religion. You also had Howard Thurman, who served as the Dean of Chapel at Howard. And these individuals, all under the support of President Mordecai Johnson, traveled to India and met with Gandhi at his ashram and talked to Gandhi about the possibility of nonviolent movements based on the science of nonviolence being launched within the United States. These individuals would all become important role models to Martin Luther King Jr. So of course, Benjamin Mays was president of Morehouse College when Dr. King attended. Howard Thurman was a good friend of the King family, so he was Dean of Chapel at Boston University when King attended Boston. William Stewart Nelson became a very close advisor to Dr. King, and so these individuals were very close and always had Dr. King's ear. So that's important to note because Dr. King never met Gandhi, but his role models and mentors were individuals who had walked with Gandhi and talked with Gandhi. Well, these men were also on the circuit all across the United States. So Dr. Hudson regularly brought individuals such as William Stewart Nelson, Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman, and Howard President Mordecai Johnson to speak at Florida A&M University. Mordecai Johnson had traveled to India after the death of Gandhi and had talked about nonviolence with a number of Gandhi's disciples. But after one appearance that Professor William Stewart Nelson made at Florida A&M University, I saw a letter that Dr. Hudson wrote thanking him in particular for talking about Gandhi on the campus. And so thus it's not coincidental that you see the Montgomery bus boycott began in 1955 with King, an individual who had been influenced by these men who had walked with Gandhi and talked with Gandhi. And then just a year after that, just 6 months after that, the Tallahassee bus boycott begins with an intellectual environment that has featured so many individuals who have talked about nonviolence and individuals who had also been a great influence on Martin Luther King Jr. as well. And so that's the intellectual environment that Dr. Hudson brought to the campus, or continued on the campus. You'd had connections between those professors before, but Dr. Hudson had really worked to enhance that and build upon it. And so thus it's not coincidental that you had a Tallahassee bus boycott being launched with much of the same type of intellectual environment. So on May 28, 1956, a Tallahassee bus driver called the police after two FAMU students who were pictured in the slide, Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson, defied his efforts to enforce the Jim Crow seating policy on a local bus. The Tallahassee City Commission had an ordinance that mandated racial segregation among bus passengers. Officers arrested Jakes and Patterson for, quote unquote, being in a position to incite a riot. After being released on bail, the two women returned to the off-campus home at which they resided. The next morning on Sunday, news of the incident made the local newspaper's front page. At 5 p.m. on that Sunday evening, Jakes and Patterson answered a knock on the door of their off-campus residence, and outside they discovered a burning cross on their lawn. Fearing what might await them after dark, the women fled to a FAMU dormitory. Later that same night, FAMU President George W. Gore summoned James Hudson and a handful of faculty members, administrators, and student leaders to his home. Dr. Hudson was among them. Dr. Hudson recalled that Dr. Gore was not at ease with what had transpired and was, quote unquote, hoping that somehow this might be contained. But Dr. Hudson believed that city officials had contacted the president and told him to discourage FAMU students from launching any disruptive demonstrations. Although he believed that President Gore had FAMU's best interests at heart, Dr. Hudson believed that it was too late to contain the student anger. The hundreds of soldiers in training and the black veterans and FAMU student body were in particular outraged by what had been done to Jakes and Patterson with the cross burning. As part of its federal land grant mission, FAMU provided military training in its curriculum. Beginning in 1902, all male students were required to participate in the Auxiliary Cadet Corps. Former President William H. Gray built upon this foundation by persuading the U.S. Army to establish a senior anti-aircraft unit of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC, at the institution. And so FAMU's ROTC, launched in 1948, consisted of a 2-year basic program that was mandatory for all male students and a 2-year advanced program, which led to a post-graduation reserve in the U.S. Army. Additionally, Gray had lobbied successfully for the state government and the Federal Veterans Housing Authority to build a veterans housing project at FAMU. And so this opened in 1948. It was named after James R. Polkinghorne, a former FAMU student who had lost his life on May 5, 1944, while leading a squadron of P-39 fighters in Italy. Polkinghorne Village had 170 units for married veterans and 11 barracks to house 250 single veterans. By the 1949-1950 school year, veterans utilizing their GI benefits accounted for 415 of FAMU's 1,811 students. For several years, Hudson and his family had lived in Polkinghorne. Hudson understood the presence of so many men who were engaged in or preparing for military combat had contributed to a campus atmosphere that had little tolerance for racial abuse. FAMU alumni remembered Hudson's role in their weekly training regimen. Hudson's Wednesday afternoon and Sunday morning chapel services were mandatory for all students. Auxiliary cadets were required to attend the assemblies wearing their official uniform, and ROTC members wore their Army-issued attire. In this picture, you see Lee Hall in 1947. Again, this is where FAMU's chapel services were held, as led by Dr. Hudson. One of the individuals who I interviewed for my research was the late FAMU president, Dr. Frederick S. Humphreys. Dr. Humphreys was a former senior ROTC member who took Hudson's logic course, and he attended the Lee Hall meeting at which students voted to launch the bus boycott. He recalled that the language Hudson used in his sermons paralleled the language students chose to use when they began their protest. A Roman Catholic, Humphreys remembered how Hudson had emphasized dignity, value, and equality of all human life, as well as the moral obligation to resist evil. Brodus Hartley, the student body president, who convened the meeting in Lee Hall and coordinated the vote to officially boycott the buses, was also an ROTC candidate who had taken, who had taken Hudson's logic course. Dr. Hudson was an individual whom he credited as a source of inspiration. Hartley remembered how the themes that Dr. Hudson had stressed in chapel, such as self-respect and fairness, were on his mind as he delivered his speech, urging the student body to rise against the aggression that had been directed toward Jackson Patterson. Dr. Hudson, as president of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, moved quickly to push the African American community toward continuing the bus boycott. The students had voted to boycott buses for the remainder of the semester, which was less than 2 weeks. And so Hudson envisioned the professional black community in Tallahassee taking over leadership of the bus boycott. So a meeting was convened at the regularly scheduled meeting of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, or IMA. The attendees agreed to appoint a committee to meet with the city manager and the bus company manager. The delegation, which included Hudson and Steele, was to express the group's support for the student protest and submit grievances about the treatment that black riders received. And they were, after that, to report back at a meeting at Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. The dismissive posture of the city manager and the bus company manager, who both told the IMA that they could do nothing without the city commission's consent, helped push the greater black community toward continuing the bus boycott. So at the evening meeting, after reporting that the city officials were not going to agree to any compromise or concessions, the audience gathered there at Bethel Missionary Baptist Church voted overwhelmingly to continue the bus boycott. And there they also formed the Intercivic Council with Reverend Steele serving as president and Hudson serving as chaplain. And they also adopted an identical list of demands to the Montgomery Improvement Association, again, then led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It included the right to be seated on a first-come, first-served basis, more courtesy by drivers, the employment of black drivers on predominantly black routes as well. Additionally, the ICC began planning carpool operations to transport members who did not own automobiles or could not walk to work. And so Dr. Hudson's wife and son volunteered to be drivers. With the ICC, the bus boycott, again, was taken over by the African American professional community within Tallahassee, Florida. Anticipating threats and violence from opponents, Hudson conducted a series of seminars on nonviolent resistance at Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. ICC member Laura Dixie, who I interviewed, said that she attended some of those sessions. And so she recalled that Hudson walked the audience through hostile scenarios that could occur while they were carpooling or walking to work and advised them on how to respond. And so from my research, I saw that it was most likely that Hudson received support from the Fellowship of Reconciliation in learning how to coordinate nonviolent workshops. The Fellowship of Reconciliation is an organization dedicated to pacifism, to nonviolent resistance. Glenn Smiley, field secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, met very early on with Dr. King in Montgomery at the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. He was introduced by Bayard Rustin, former member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and a member of the War Resisters League at that time. And so the Reverend Glenn Smiley also came to the Tallahassee community shortly after the beginning of the Tallahassee bus boycott. And the records of the fellowship say that he met with members of the steering committee and also remained in constant contact with them. So the Hudson papers show a great deal of correspondence between Smiley and Hudson. So it's very likely that he received support. Dr. Hudson received support from the Fellowship of Reconciliation and learning how to coordinate nonviolent seminars. And they would continue throughout the rest of the movement as well. So on November 13th, 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a lower court's ruling in the Montgomery Improvement Association-backed Browder v. Gale decision, which had declared racial segregation and bus transportation to be unconstitutional. The beginning of the end of segregation in Tallahassee's bus system began when the financially struggling city's transit company began to fight the city commission over its demand for Jim Crow seating. The ICC also kept up pressure by launching demonstrations to test compliance with the Browder v. Gale decision. And so the actual enforcement of segregated seating gradually declined as an increasing number of bus drivers simply disregarded the tradition of segregation. By 1957, Jim Crow had died a quiet death on Tallahassee's bus routes. And so shortly afterward, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference would be founded with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as president and the Intercivic Council of Tallahassee, or ICC, serving as one of the affiliate organizations. Reflecting upon the Tallahassee bus boycott in 1958, Hudson praised it as a watershed event that had birthed a new movement for social change in Florida's capital city. He proudly noted how protesters had clung to nonviolent discipline taught by his seminars in the midst of fierce hostilities from opponents. And so this particular slide from the Florida State Archives shows one of the images of the carpool. Additionally, this is a photo of Reverend Steele participating in a test ride demonstration to test compliance with the Browder v. Gale decision that had declared bus segregation to be unconstitutional. Again, one of the later pictures of Dr. Hudson from his tenure at Florida A&M University. And I'll end with this picture, which is also the last picture in my book, but it depicts Dr. Hudson during a trip to Busch Gardens in Tampa Bay. And so he went with a group of friends. One family friend had asked him to bless her home in the Tampa area. And so the group of friends who accompanied Dr. Hudson on this trip included the young woman who's pictured in this particular slide. And so this is Miss Betty Jean Hubbard. Today she's Miss Betty Rivers, my mother. So she knew Dr. Hudson while he was working throughout Tallahassee. But Dr. Hudson has been an honor to study, and I'm just so happy that the University Press of Florida supported this project. And I'm just honored by the opportunity to share more about his story with the University Press of Florida and through this generous opportunity to speak to you today. So thank you.
We have time for questions, and if people have questions, I can hand them the mic so that they can be easily heard if people want to.
Dr. Rivers, thank you for being here today. It's a marvelous book that this talk is based on. And I guess I had a question about your practice as a historian. So when you're doing biography, right, one of the challenges, right, is to get inside the sort of internal mind of your subject. And you were, I think, very fortunate to have a lot of documents that gave you that entry. I'm actually just curious to know, were there any moments where you felt that you really couldn't quite get there, right? That there were maybe decisions that were made or whatever it was, where you felt like you weren't really sure exactly what was going on?
That's an excellent question, and I just tried to really find the context clues. Dr. Hudson was someone who was very, very private about his inner thoughts, and so I really, throughout the process, focused on his writings, and really, in particular, started to see more the clues that he left in his philosophy. So I think that when we are working on scholarship, I think that scholarship is intensely personal. Scholarship is usually answering deeply held questions that we as individuals have. And so you can tell a lot about a way an individual is thinking through their scholarship. And so that's one thing I try to work out through the book. I think that the questions that Dr. Hudson was asking about God, about the meaning of life, about justice and fairness, all came from his upbringing, particularly the loss of his arm as a youth, and also the tragic loss of his mother. His mother passed away from typhoid fever when he was very young. And so I saw also parallels with Edgar Sheffield Brightman. Edgar Brightman really goes through a big philosophical perspective change after his first wife dies from cancer. And so you see how both Hudson and Brightman are various ways in their philosophy struggling with these traumatic losses and trying to make sense of it, and trying to also chart a way forward with their lives after these huge losses. So that's where I really wanted to end up focusing, is through the clues that he left in his philosophy. So thank you.
Another question?
Thank you for that presentation.
Oh, yes, thank you.
On the topic of his philosophy, would you be able to summarize his dissertation topic for his Doctor of Philosophy?
His dissertation topic focused on Alfred North Whitehead. And so Alfred North Whitehead was one of the major figures in process theology. So Dr. Hudson's work really focused on the doctrine of the actual occasion. And it, to try to go to that requires a great deal of detail. And that's something I really talk about, in particular in the chapter, The Kingdom of God, in which it really breaks down Dr. Hudson's philosophy. But one of the key questions in the philosophy of religion is, what is the fundamental uncreated element behind that is at the foundation of existence? And so Alfred North Whitehead and Dr. Hudson agreed that it was the actual occasion, these units of experience that continue on. And so they come into activity and then go dormant, but before they leave, they influence other actual occasions as well. And so this is Dr. Hudson really trying to get to, again, the foundation of life, and he builds this in with the philosophy of personalism. So the philosophy of personalism asserts that mind is the best clue to the mysteries of existence. The personalists really agree with René Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." So what exists? We know that the mind exists. How do we know? It's self-evident. And from that, personalists believe that the mind can detect experiences such as, or truths such as, a system of moral laws. And so Dr. Edgar Brightman wrote in particular about moral laws that he argued were as real as the physical laws of the earth. And that also was something that Martin Luther King Jr. agreed with. So when you hear Dr. King say the moral arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, that's also him expressing his belief in moral laws as well, which there are personalists, many personalists who agreed with Edgar Sheffield Brightman believe were as real as physical laws. And so you see Dr. Hudson blending process theology with personalism and using that to chart a number of answers, and really using that in order to build a philosophical foundation for the civil rights movement, because Dr. King would use the philosophy of personalism very extensively throughout the civil rights movement, and Hudson, prior to King, was the most prominent personalist within the National Baptist Convention, which was and still is today the largest black religious organization in the United States. And you see him using the language of personalism, the language of moral laws, a little bit of process theology, and the Sunday school lessons he authored from 1953 to 1954. So one of the arguments I make is that that helped to set a foundation for reception to King's use of philosophical personalism as the philosophy of the civil rights movement.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Rivers. Thank you for the talk. I was curious, just like in all of the research you've done, are there any specific like areas where you think there, or what specific areas do you think are like most in need of like further research?
Yes. Thank you. That's an excellent question. We have a number of great researchers here, and hopefully a number of you will write books on Florida history and other historical topics. But I definitely think there is a need for more biographies. And so biographies can be somewhat challenging to write because they depend all upon the sources. You might not be able to have enough sources for a biography. But I think one of the most important things that young researchers can do, if you can, is to interview individuals from previous generations. And so I recall when I first attended graduate school, I took a course of World War II by a professor who later served on my dissertation committee, Dr. Michael Bess. And so he taught that World War II course for years. And one of the assignments that he would have regularly was to ask the students to interview someone who had lived during the World War II generation. But already when I was there, and that was starting in 2004, he said that he was not going to be able to continue that assignment very long because unfortunately the World War II generation was leaving us. I was fortunate to be able to talk to, actually the book is dedicated to my late grandparents who both lived through both the Great Depression and World War II. And that was just a treasure to be able to talk to them about their memories of moving through those times of chaos, uncertainty, and still pursuing. And so that's why my grandparents are among my greatest heroes. But I think that young people can really, and again, you have a great Dr. Samuel Proctor oral history program that can provide you guidance, but doing interviews with individuals who lived through past generations and recording their memories and keeping those for posterity. And that's also particularly important when it comes to the histories and the records pertaining to women, because very oftentimes historians are using papers collections from major political, social institutions that are male dominated. But oral history really helps us to collect more of the memories of women for historical posterity as well too. So I think that oral history, I think that biographies are areas in which we need a lot more historical research and support. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for that talk. I really learned a lot.
Thank you.
As someone who is kind of like in media production, I love like being able to go to a certain few questions to reveal a lot of insights. Do you have kind of a go-to question that you have found reveals some of the most interesting insights in your research?
Thank you. Well, it's always good to meet a person focusing in media. I earned my undergraduate degree in public relations from the School of Journalism and Graphic Communication at Florida A&M University. So learned all that good news writing, reporting. Actually was an associate producer at the local CBS affiliate news station in Tallahassee, Florida, on WCTV for a year as well too. So that was a wonderful experience. So I think journalism and history work very well together. So it's always good to see students who are very interested in media. But I always learn the who, what, why, and when questions. Those are questions that really help to get to the core of the issue, and I think get the basic information that really needs to be studied. So just those fundamentals, I think, really work very well. And I think that's also important in being able to speak in plain language as well. One of the issues sometimes in scholarship is that scholarship too often uses jargon. It uses language that's not all that accessible. But I think with those basic questions that are asked in journalism, the who, what, when, where, and why, that really helps to make the writing clear. It really helps to communicate it well. And I think that helps really when it comes to good storytelling as well. So yes, journalism, media, history all go well together, and I think that they are definitely needed. And we see just the reception of documentaries today. I mean, documentaries have never been more important or influential as they are today. And I think they're just continuing great possibilities that you have here on this campus with your great media programs and School of Journalism here.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you have one.
Sorry. Hi.
Hello.
You obviously make the decision to characterize James Hudson as largely forgotten. Was his life completely untouched by any historiography before your book, or are there perhaps a few secondary sources that might have touched on him?
Yes, there were some secondary sources that touched on him. So the major study of the Tallahassee bus boycott is The Pain and the Promise by Dr. Glenda Ravi. And so she did have information about Dr. Hudson there as well. But there just, I don't think was a tremendous amount of information that was available for her while she was working on first her PhD dissertation and then her book. And so that gets into one of the issues that Dr. Claiborne Carson, who was the first director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Institute at Stanford, talked about, particularly when it comes to African American history. Oftentimes in African American history, you have to build the collections when it comes to finding those primary sources. And so Dr. Carson called it basement and attic research. So I was fortunate to be able to go to the basement of Attorney Hudson's home, which is very nice. He has a very nice home in DC. But you hear stories of many historians of African American history going to basements and attics to try to rescue these papers in order to get them for historical posterity. So I think that's the reason why, after Reverend C.K. Steele passed away, a lot of his papers got scattered. So fortunately, we have the dissertation by Dr. Gregory Pageant on him, but it's just difficult to find a lot of his original papers that he had due to them just being spread apart while he passed away. And also you had the Tallahassee bus protest study, which was a scholarly study produced by Dr. Charles U. Smith of FAMU and Dr. Louis Callahan of Florida State, which was sponsored by the Anti-Defamation League, and that was published actually while the Tallahassee bus boycott was ongoing. So it had some information about Dr. Hudson. But also I found a great interview that was done by special collection, that's in special collections at Florida State University with Dr. Hudson. There were some scholars who did an oral history project and interviewed a number of the participants in the Tallahassee bus boycott. So it was just a matter of building upon the secondary literature that we had, which mentioned Dr. Hudson, but going deeper into that, particularly with the use of the James Hudson papers, the papers I received from his son, and also the papers I was able to locate at Boston University and a number of the other places I visited. So thank you.
And recognizing this may be the last question, what's your next project? What's
Well, thank you. We appreciate that.
after finishing this monumental work? It's always what's next.
Thank you, thank you. I'm particularly interested in studying the religious roots of Howard University, and so seeing the way in which Howard University influenced Dr. Hudson, influenced the civil rights movement, and has influenced so much of African American history. I think that really looking at the religious roots of the institution would be phenomenal. You just had so many dynamic individuals who served on Howard University's Board of Trustees. So Frederick Douglass served on the Board of Trustees, Booker T. Washington served on the Board of Trustees, and just looking at the history of the chapel there. And also I'd like to take it beyond just Howard University, but also look at the precedents in ancient history that set the foundation for Howard University's religious roots. So I've seen some studies that look at the ancient roots of America's past, and I'd like to do something similar to that for Howard University. So that's something that really interests me because that's I still think a topic that is still understudied. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. Do me a favor. Everybody stand up for a quick second. Just stand up. Turn around a couple times. And then, when you get ready, sit back down, please.
All
right. My son did a great job in introducing his mother, my wife, but I want Betty Jean to stand up again, my wife. She puts up with both of us, and that's quite a chore. I'd like to address the first question, and I want to start off like this. Isn't it strange? Isn't it strange that princes and kings and clowns that caper in sawdust rings and common people like you and me, we are the builders for eternity. To each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mask, and a book of rules. And each must make in our life a flown, whether we're going to be stumbling blocks or stepping stones. Isn't it strange? It's not strange that we're here talking about history. History is important. We must deal with history in a very truthful way. Now, my good friend James said, what are some challenges? I'll tell you one challenge for me, but I am too old to deal with this particular challenge, so I do what I want to do. How do you teach politically, historically sensitive topics without pissing people off to the highest degree of pistivity? How do you do that? Well, I don't know how to do that. I teach my courses. I am an antebellum historian. I teach about slavery. Now, I give my students an opportunity. After I have given a talk, I asked them to exchange. I said, if you disagree with what I said, fine. Tell me why you disagree, but just don't tell me you disagree. Give me something that I can think about from a different perspective. I said, what is history? History is the study of the past in its totality, not your history or my history. It's our history. You cannot talk about history simply from the top about great leaders without talking about women, without talking about indigenous people, without talking about other ethnic groups. That is what made America a great country to live in. I mean, we got to do that. It's not just about, they say, well, African American history. African American history is something that folks, they don't talk about, they say African American history. No, I say African American history. I teach African American history. You know why I teach African American history? Because African American history is American history. It's American history. When I talk about African Americans, I talk about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, how enslaved people were a part of the Constitution, the three-fifths compromise, the large states, small states, and how representation came about. All that's a part. You cannot talk about the formation of the Constitution in 1787 without talking about all the dynamics. You're leaving out history. You don't teach history just from a particular vantage point and leave out the rest of the truth. We got to talk about gender. We got to talk about race. We got to talk about health disparities. We got to talk about poverty. If we don't, what are we doing in America? It's just not one way or the other. We live in a very complex, complicated society. Do we want our students to think critically, or do we want to just simply pound one perspective down their throats and say, this is it, don't think out the box? These smart students here will be our leaders. What are we instilling them with? How are we getting them to think critically about primary sources, built-in bias? We got to be able to teach in a free society without being afraid to have students talk to each other. I am too old. I don't know how to change the way I teach y'all. I teach all students, black, white, Hispanic, all of them. And I teach about the African American experience, all experiences, indigenous people, the importance of immigration, all of that. And I've not upset any students because I have presented it as best I could in a fair and truthful manner. Not ignoring any student regardless of race, color, or creed. It's about teaching, Steve, and you do that in your classes. It's about teaching so that students can think about it on their own. Give them a project. If you want to know more about it, this is your project. And that's the way I was taught when I was in undergraduate school. I remember my professor in undergraduate said, Dr. Bellamy, he said, Larry, I want you to do a study on Florida. And I thought I was pretty sharp. I read a lot, you know, I had good grade point average. I said, Doc, in class, when he gave me the assignment, I said, Dr. Bellamy, nothing to know about Florida. You know, Florida is the land of Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, you know. And the only thing I learned in high school, Doc, was Ponce de Leon thought he had found the fountain of youth. Other than that, there's nothing about, he said, there's a lot more, Larry, about Florida. Just do what I ask you to do, please. And when I started studying the great state of Florida, I was shocked. And when I went on to graduate school and got my master's from Villanova, my first doctorate from Carnegie Mellon, my second doctorate from the University of London, I studied Florida. I went over to, at the University of London, I went over to the British Archives, saw the Atlantic link, the Atlantic whirl. I studied Corporal Hanjan, who came from the Gullah countries of Ghana, from West Africa, traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, ending in Charleston, being sold from Charleston to Jacksonville, living to be 117 years old, and talking about his experiences and the customs and the ancestral worship and the beautiful customs that he brought. He said, they didn't take it all from me, because I brought it on the boat with me. And I talk about it. And until we can talk about history and tell stories, not about dates, 1860 the Civil War, 1850 Compromise, 1787 Constitution. We use dates as a means to an end, but not an end in themselves. We use them to get somewhere. But it's about the story. It's about human beings coming together to tell the story. And one of the great institutions to do that, I'm telling you, the University of Florida was instrumental in the research. I'm working on my 10th book that I've either authored or co-authored, and the P.K. Young Library and James Coote and my good buddy Boyd over here. I tell you, we have done a lot to bring forth the history of Florida. And we need you to take an interest in the history of Florida, the third largest state in the Union, and very few people know anything about Florida. You ask some general questions. I have students all over the world come, and the first question I ask, how many counties are there in the state of Florida? Oh my God. 189. Oh, it's just like Georgia, 159. How many counties are named after a fruit? Don't know. How many counties named after a mammal? Manatee. How many counties are named after presidents? How many counties, my studies suggest to slavery in Florida that in 1865, 65% of all the population in Middle Florida consisted of enslaved people. They did most of the work. 90% of the cotton was produced by Middle Florida. And because enslaved people were so instrumental, how many counties in Florida named after an African American? You got it named after a mammal, named after a fruit. You went so far and loved the conquistadors that you named 2 counties after a conquistador. Hernando de Soto. DeSoto County, Hernando County, after the same person. But yet, nothing after an African American. I know you're saying, what the hell is Larry Rivers talking about? I'm talking about working together to make this history real, truthful, so that when people go out, one of the worst things that I faced, students, was not being taught certain concepts. And when I went out in the real world and I learned them for myself, I was pissed off to the highest degree of what? Pissivity. Because people left it out. And I said, I went to some of the best schools in the country. It's like they deliberately left it out. I'm not saying talk about this group less and this group more. I'm talking about all the groups together. That's what it's all about. I'm sorry, son. Go ahead. I mean, I just took over the whole thing, man.
No, when Dad talks, I listen. So that's the way it is. But you see the type of teaching and the type of advice that I grew up listening to. And so one thing that I'd like to do when I teach history is to talk about the connection between history and current events. And again, that comes partially from being a journalist. But I think that, especially for those of us who teach 20th century history, history can help us to understand what's going on in the news today. And so when I talk about the post-World War II world, we're talking about NATO, we're talking about the United Nations, we're talking about the International Monetary Fund, we're talking about the origins of the Cold War and so many of the organizations that were part of that historic struggle. And so just understanding history helps us to make sense of what's going on today and to understand that everything has roots, everything has a cause, nothing just is, nothing just came to be out of nowhere. And talking about history in connection to current events really, I think, helps us to understand the world better, helps us to understand each other better, and really provides a basis for better understanding. And I think more than ever today, it's very important to have news literacy and also to use the tools of historians to assess the credibility of sources. And so that's just so critical. You have no shortage of opinions, no shortage of statements being said online, but how do we assess the credibility? And so that's one of the basic tools that an historian has to ask. Okay, what is this person's direct knowledge of this? What is this person's qualifications to talk about this? What might be this person's agenda? Does this person have any biases? Those things all have to come into play when we are assessing the credibility of sources in history and the credibility of sources that we're listening to and the voices that we hear throughout media platforms and on the internet today. And I think that, again, history and journalism and current events all work together in order to provide us with a better understanding of our world.
My friends, we cannot afford in these times to be quiet. If there's something that we disagree with, we got the mechanisms, the lawful mechanisms. Let me repeat that, the lawful mechanisms to challenge it. But when you let certain things that you disagree with go unchallenged, then those individuals take another step. You don't challenge that. And before you know it, you can't challenge because you've let all the previous times that you should have challenged things go by. This is not the time to be quiet. You must state your opinions about certain things if you believe it. I just believe in an inclusive society. That's the way I was brought up as a kid. Now, you know, my background, one of 8 children, I wasn't exposed to African American history when I was a child. You know who taught me African American history? My mama. My daddy was a barber. He worked for 50 cents a head back in the day. He started at 7 o'clock in the morning and finished at 9 in the evening, 14 hours on his feet a day. And it was left up to mama to bring it all together. I'm one of 8 siblings. And she got me interested in history. But she often told me it was a struggle to try to find books during the late 40s, early 50s on the African American experience. And I said, Mama, when I get grown up, I'm going to be writing some books. I just didn't know that I would actually be writing some books. But she gave me the inspiration. We have someone in our life that inspires us to do certain things. Take that inspiration and do the best you can with it.
And something that I'd like to say in my classrooms as well is that I really believe that history in particular is where we can talk about tough issues with clarity. And so we don't run away from the tough issues in history. We take them head on. And it's very important to get into the way in which we define issues because so much oftentimes of what we are debating is just the definitions of an issue. What are the parameters of it? And looking at history, taking these things head on, I think provides also an exercise in civility. Civility is sorely needed at all points in history, but I think there's no greater need than the moment that we're in is for civil conversation. So being able to ask questions, being able to express disagreements in a way that is respectful, that is expressed in good faith. I think that those are the types of ways in which we can use history in order to set a pathway to create the society and the world that we really want to live in.
Yeah. Now, are there any questions? Because we could be talking, because, you know, I'm an old teacher. I can talk from now till it gets dark, and then we get some coffee, wake back up, and Steve will start talking some more, boy. So y'all need to, if y'all got a question, please ask me or my son, because we don't want to keep you here all afternoon. We know your time is precious, and we really thank each and every one of you for coming. You didn't have to do it, but you did, so thank you very, very much. Question? Yes?
I have one concern. When you were talking about Howard University is
Yes.
your next activity and working with them and working with religion, black religion.
Yes.
I work with Holiness Pentecostals.
Oh, okay.
And I was told to go to Howard University to get me started, to work with the dean there. Right. And so I found that they were the key people for me, because they knew in every segment where folks were and what they were doing. Not just Baptists and Methodists, but they knew the Catholics, they knew the Jewish people, they knew culture. And so we have to keep that in mind when we are doing research now in all subject fields. We ignore the black college. The black college can put you where you need to go and get you started. And I really appreciate you bringing that point in and working with maybe not only Howard, but with other institutions that will help us to get a ground level as to where to start and to know the people. And of course, we don't leave out Tuskegee. because we don't function without going there and getting their background. And these black colleges really are the best to get you moving. I went to non-black college. I went to North Carolina Central in Durham, which I know most of you are familiar with, but then I went to the University of Michigan. And when I went to the University of Michigan, they had very little knowledge about how to deal with certain issues and how to think. And some of the thinking patterns that I picked up were from black colleges that I could carry to these white institutions and use it. Case in point, Jane Austen. Jane Austen is white, okay? That was my lady that I had to do research on. I found more on Jane Austen than probably they had ever known, because I had been to a black institution and we knew where to go, and how to get that information. The professor invited me in and we wrote an article about how to do research. Now, Jane Austen, going back in the 1800s and before, finding research. And these folks are supposed to be the creme de creme. They know, but they couldn't find it. And they had no knowledge as to how to even think about finding it. And that's something that our black institutions, and I'm not just speaking for the University of Florida because I work here. I was a librarian here. I was the first African-American reference librarian hired in 1977. Oh, wow. So I've been around for a long time. But the point of it is, we need to share, and we need to share our cultures. And then when you spoke in terms of London, I was thinking in terms of dealing with slavery, transatlantic slave trade. When you hear the history of how they perceive how we came to this country, it's different than what we teach in this country. You know, it's totally different. And so we need to learn what other cultures are saying and doing. The reasons they said the slave trade ended was much different than what I would tell you that the U.S. has said. And so those are things that we don't know. You don't have a thing to know about it, and you don't seem to be concerned about those issues. We teach certain things, and that's it. And we leave you at that point.
Thank you.
Very much, yes. I agree that HBCU history is a gold mine, and it's just very important to get people into these archives. And it's been inspiring to see so many of HBCUs, particularly Florida A&M University, recently receiving some additional grants to digitize these collections. And so I think that digitization is really going to open up even more opportunities for exploring the histories of these institutions that, again, we just still do not have enough studies on. We really just don't have enough people on deck in the history profession at all. It's really, for so many people who study and research history, it's a labor of love. And so, again, that's why I try to emphasize to my students, you don't have to be a person with a master's or PhD in history to do history. You can research, you can collect history, and so much of the work that you do will likely be used in books and peer-reviewed articles and others. And just everything that you can collect, everything that you can do has a purpose, has meaning, and is valuable.
I'd like to turn around for just a quick second before we leave and ask anyone in the audience to share with my son and myself what you are doing in terms of any kind of research. Whatever research you're doing is good research. And I love a person who's doing research of any kind, about anything, about anyone. Is there someone brave enough? Yes, sir. He's got it. Okay.
So I'm actually reading a few of your books, Dr. Rivers Senior.
I pity you, but go ahead. Try your best to get through them. Try.
No. I've really appreciated them. I have like Laborers in the Vineyard of the Lord here, but I'm trying to do a senior thesis project right now in like poverty in Alachua County during Reconstruction. So I've really appreciated using some of your work as like a reference in that. I mean, I'm still in the relatively early like stages of it, but that's sort of my research.
Do me a favor. When you get really started, send me a couple sentences. I might be able to help you with some sources or something like that, but just tell me how you're doing, okay? I'm easy to reach. You go to FAMU, I'm all over the place, so I'm I've been there a long time. I'm 74, so I've been around the mulberry bush a couple of times.
No, that would be really amazing. I'd really appreciate that.
Okay, very
Best
good.
wishes with that research too. The Reconstruction period is, I think, one of the most fascinating periods in history. I think if I weren't a civil rights historian, I'd be a Reconstruction historian. So that's this Reconstruction period so much in order to set the foundation for the civil rights movement. So yes, best wishes on that. All right. I think we have one more here.
All right, we'll make this last question. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, no, certainly. Ask your question, sir.
I suppose right now the research project I'm working on is the post office as a social institution in the Reconstruction era South. I could talk more about it, but I'm not really prepared to.
Well, that's an interesting subject because I have not read many studies on the post office as a social institution, and it really is. People came together, and when they were, getting their mail, they stopped and talked about the affairs of the day. And in a way, I look at the post office almost, y'all don't get on me now, but I look at the post office almost like a religious institution, because when you go to church, no matter what the denomination, you found out what was going on in the community, who was doing what, who was getting married, who's going off, who disappeared. And in the post office, at the post office, the same kinds of things happen. So I think you're on to a great topic. Pursue it.
And of course, that the idea of the community role of community that the post office had there.
The role of community.
And why it was originally illegal to hire African Americans as postal clerks.
Exactly.
After the revolution in Jamaica.
Yeah. And even when things loosened up, Woodrow Wilson reinstated segregation in the post office when blacks could, before his administration, there was not a lot of fanfare, but if you were a black person, you could just go anywhere you wanted. They didn't advertise. But after Birth of a Nation and Wilson looking at all that, he decided that he would enforce segregation. That's another story for another time. Thank you all very much, and thank you for coming. We appreciate it. I want to thank James again, and Boyd, and Steve for making sure, he encouraged his class to come, and everybody else. Thank y'all so much.